Audio for TRS-80 Trash Talk is hosted by CyberEars. When you need a rock-solid platform to host and distribute your podcast or other audio media, head over to cyberears.com. Fast, reliable hosting with unlimited bandwidth. CyberEars is your audio on your terms. Welcome to episode 3 of TRS-80 Trash Talk. This is the show that focuses on the Tandy Radio Shack line of TRS-80 computers exclusively, from the Model 1 in 1977 all the way up to the 16-bit Tandy 6000 in 1986. In this episode, we're going to take a look at the Model 2 line of TRS-80 computers. The Model 2 is much less well known than its smaller brother, the Model 1. It was a business-oriented microcomputer that was designed for small to medium-sized offices. There were few games, but lots of business software packages, such as general ledgers, word processing, and databases available. Most Model 2s lived a hard and unglamorous life in offices and back rooms across the country and the world, which means few of them are around today. This rarity is a part of what makes them an interesting machine today. The Model 2 was followed up by the Model 16, the Model 12, the Model 16B, and finally, the ultimate TRS-80, the Tandy 6000. These later machines were very capable and powerful Unix-based workstations. So for this episode, the regular Trash Talk crew is on holiday, and we'll be joined by a special guest host, Myles Wakeham. So sit back and enjoy this history lesson on the Model 2 line. I'm sure for most of you this will be new and interesting information. As with the Model 1, 3, and 4, we'll be following up with more in-depth segments on the Model 2 line in future episodes. But first up is a message from our sponsors, and then a piece of listener feedback. Enjoy.
Now from Radio Shack, the computer experts, the new 80K TRS-80 Model 12. Notice the easy-to-read green screen.
It'll do our accounting.
Our disk stores over 1 million characters, about 4 times more than others, and it has incredible expandability. It'll do our word processing.
And filing.
Even planning and projections.
That's all it costs?
We call it getting the most for your money. The TRS-80 Model 12 from $31.99. Only at Radio Shack and Radio Shack Computer Centers.
Hello, TRS-80 Trash Talkers. This is Mike Rowan. I'm an active member of the color computer community, and I heard about your podcast from listening to the Coco Crew podcast. I listened to your first 2 episodes and have been very pleased with the content. I was 13 years old when my father brought home a TRS-80 Model 1, 16K, Level 2, even had the keypad on it. That night we were up till 3 in the morning playing blackjack and backgammon, the tape that came with the computer. A few years later, my father bought the same L&W kit for the expansion interface that you were talking about because it was so much cheaper than paying the big dollars for the Radio Shack version. I was 14 or 15 and spent hours and hours soldering DIP sockets to a motherboard. As it happens, we also had the same wonky screen printer that you talked about in your show. I remember playing some Big 5 games and doing screen prints of different screen levels and high scores. Once in a while, I would probably print out some really complicated basic code to do some debugging, but no, it wasn't a very practical device, but it was the only printer you could connect to the Model 1 at the time. I actually saved some of those printouts, and probably 10 years later, they were completely unreadable on that electrostatic paper. It turned into something completely unlegible. It was really great to hear the Radio Shack voice synthesizer again. I enjoyed listening to your commentary on it and the actual synthesizer itself. I conned my father into buying me a Digitalker for the TRS-80 Model 1. It was based on a national semiconductor chip that actually had digitized speech on the chip. So it had a vocabulary of about 150, 160 words. Most of it was geared toward telemetry. So it was very good at reading numbers or dollar amounts and values, letters, and it had several words you could kind of paste together to make speech. But of course, you couldn't say everything like you could with a phoneme voice synthesizer. You could make it sound male or female, and you could also interrupt the speech. So if you made it say something, you could cut it off after, either the first sound or abridge the word to kind of form new words if you were clever enough to program it that way. But speech was a very powerful element that gave it that science fiction feel. Definitely a lot of fun. Regardless of the model of computer you may have started out with, the common thread of Radio Shack and Tandy automatically gives you common ground. Radio Shack made the technology cheap and attainable, but it was up to all of us to make the discoveries about what the machines could do. Well, thanks to everyone who makes TRS-80 Trash Talk possible. I enjoy listening, and I definitely will be a regular listener. I'm not sure which VCF events I may make it to this year, but I will definitely be on the lookout for all of you, to the ones I do make it to. However, I will be at the last annual Cocoa Fest in Lombard, Illinois on April 23rd and 24th. It's always great to meet other Tandy Radio Shack computer enthusiasts, no matter what the model is. We would love to see you, and I'm sure I'm not the only one who has some deep experience with the Silver Beasts. Thanks for the great podcast, and I and your listeners look forward to more.
So as we mentioned, here on the podcast, we're going to be covering all models of TRS-80. Not just the popular Model 1 and 3 and 4, but also the much less well-known business machines. That's the Model 2 line, which includes the Model 2, the 16, the 12, the 16B, and the 6000. And as we did for the Model 1, 3, and 4, we're going to start by giving an overview history of the Model 2 line. And joining me here today to engage in this history lesson of the Model 2 line is Mr. Myles Wakeham. Hi, Myles.
Hey, how are you?
Great. Really happy you can join us here today. The listeners, if you're listeners also of the Floppy Days podcast, you may have heard the episode that Myles was involved with, where he went into quite a deep dive of the history of the Model 2. So he's going to be joining the Trash Talk team, and he's going to be helping us talking about this line of machines. And Myles, you want to tell the listeners a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Well, I'm an old TRS-80 buff from way back. My first experience with TRS-80s was a Model 1 Level 1 4K machine in 1978, and I'm dating myself as I speak. But I was lucky enough as a kid. I was in my teenage years, and I had a chance to sit in front of one of these machines. And the funny thing about it was I got hooked very quickly, and thankfully it turned into a career for me. So not with the TRS-80 just for that machine, but I ended up buying a TRS-80 Model 1 Level 2 probably a few months later. And then from that, I think I had a Model 3 and then dabbled in different platforms after that. But I was one of the guys back in the first instances of those machines to get hands-on with them. And that was a wonderful thing, and I definitely wore out my welcome at the local Tandy Computer Center in the city I was in. I'm sure I was the kid they wanted to kick out of there all the time, but what do you do?
Right. Great. And when did you become involved with the Model 2?
Well, I've always seen a Model 2 from afar. I was, again, as I mentioned, I was, one of those kids that hung out in the Tandy Computer Center in the city where I grew up. And I don't think they got a Model 2 in until it was probably 1980, but I have a feeling I may have actually seen one in late 79. It might have even been a pre-release. But yeah, it was about those times. And those computers were out of reach of a teenage kid. So
Sure.
I saw them definitely from afar, and I'm sure they didn't particularly like me in the same room as one of those machines. They were very expensive.
Sure. I never recall seeing a Model 2 back in those days. I was a younger lad, but I remember the color computer, and I vaguely remember the Model 3. Never saw a Model 2 until never heard or even seen one probably until about just a few years ago when I became involved in the vintage computing hobby. As I mentioned in the previous podcast, for some reason I became attracted to the TRS-80 line, and then just naturally I came upon, whether it was on eBay or it was someone's website or one of the forums, the mention of the Model 2, this mysterious Model 2, and just that the mysteriousness of it or the rarity of it really intrigued me to find out more about them. And
if I remember back in the when the Model 1 was out, there were magazines floating around that you creative computer type things like 80 Micro. There were a whole bunch of magazines that were really, for me, that was my core reading, was to go and get the latest magazine because everything was changing so quickly. And Radio Shack always took out these full-page or often multi-page ad spreads about the Model 2. And so, you might have got this magazine just to type in that program that was sitting in the back few pages or whatever, but you could not avoid these really expensive marketing exercises they went through with the Model 2. It became that machine of dreams, but, it was never something that was within your reach.
Right. So why don't we try to go through a timeline here on the history of the Model 2, and you can kick it off for us, start from the beginning, why it was created and when it was introduced and who developed it.
Okay. Well, I learnt a lot about my Model 2 mainly. Well, it's kind of a weird story. I got a Model 2 only a few years ago, and I pulled the thing apart and immediately wrecked half of it because I didn't realise how as big as these machines are, and they're very big and very heavy, they're quite fragile, particularly in the power supply area and the CRT. And unless you know exactly what you're doing, or you have expectations of what you're getting into, you can often fall prey with these machines. So I found myself getting a machine, wrecking a machine, and then trying to realize and trying to roll back time and learn everything there was about this machine to try to put it all back together again. I am by no means a technical expert on the Model 2 as a hardware engineer or as a software engineer would be on the machine, but the one thing that intrigued me about this machine was its history, particularly it's the people and the whole culture that went behind this machine. And so I was lucky enough to have reached out to people who were on the design team back at Tandy in Texas, and I learnt from them firsthand what a day in the life was like, in Fort Worth when they were building this. The first thing that was interesting that I'd learnt about this machine was that it's part of a line of TRS-80s that came upon the success, the overwhelming success of the Model 1. And what that meant was that at this point in time, and we're talking, I'm not sure exactly when the development of the machine probably started. I'm going to say it was probably 78, somewhere around about then. At this point in time, Tandy... Okay, well, let's firstly define Tandy and Radio Shack from a historical point of view. I mean, Tandy was, a company that was a leather goods manufacturer who had bought this chain of, I think it was 8 stores out of Boston that were called Radio Shack, and they had kind of migrated themselves into this marketplace and had really done a great thing by growing that business and then turning it into this major retail distribution chain. They were the number one, electronics and radio part vendor in the country. And they did a fantastic job at that. And when the whole kind of promise of affordable personal computers started to fly around in the mid-70s, Obviously, they wanted a piece of the action, and I don't need to repeat the story that you've already told on your show in regards to the history of the Model 1. But it was one of those things where Radio Shack was a company that based itself around retail distribution, but the most important thing that they had was a catalog. And that catalog was printed, I believe, annually, and it was designed to come out to support the holiday sales market, which for most retailers is their busiest season. So that meant that all of the computer engineering and design had to be done and timed against the catalog, which would then advertise the machines that would then have to be available for sale in the holiday period. That put a lot of stress on everybody who was involved in building these machines. And probably the person who got the worst of it was Steve Leiniger, the guy who invented effectively the Model 1, or designed or architected the Model 1. He, and this is going from what I've been told from peers and people associated with him in the time, it was enormous pressure, and there was a whole lot of burnout that was going on at that point to try to meet these dates, because they were absolutely hard deadlines they had to meet. The reason that's an important part of the Model 2 story is that the Model 1 was an enormous success. They had sold these machines. They couldn't keep up with the orders. It was amazing. They were even having to repair them themselves back in the manufacturing plant. They had no third-party or outsourced assistance per se. It was all being done by Tandy. Now, the way it worked back then was that Tandy would effectively pitch what they wanted to build to Radio Shack. Now, although they were part of the same corporate structure, part of the same family, if you like, Radio Shack still had the right of refusal about what they were being pitched by Tandy. So everybody involved in an idea of a computer had to go and literally sit in front of a bunch of guys who would make decisions. And the easiest way of kind of imagining this would be like an episode of Shark Tank, or Dragon's Den if you're in the UK, where effectively, they're going in front of these guys with a big wad of money and they're pitching this idea. Well, at the time when the Model 2 was being pitched, it wasn't very difficult for the guys with the money to say yes to that idea, because it's easy to follow your success. They'd already had this massive success with the Model 1, and so a bunch of business people with money are not going to say no to a business computer following on the heels of a successful home, consumer machine.
Right.
And that was how the Model 2, that's the genesis of the Model 2. The problem was, how do you do this with a very small staff and a very small set of resources that were already burnt out by the Model 1? And that leads to the whole rationale of what the Model 2's design was. It was designed to be kind of like the old IBM PC was, an open architecture, card-based slotted system. And it was done predominantly for the reason that they wanted the machine to be able to be built by many people, and that they could reach out to third-party manufacturers and component suppliers for hard drives, floppy drives, CRTs, power supplies. All these things were made by third parties. They were not made by Tandy. And if you ever open a Model 2 up, you'll see all the different manufacturers on them. And that represented the fact that they didn't want Steve designing the whole thing. I guess partially Steve didn't want to design the whole thing. At the same time, management probably were concerned that they were putting all their eggs in one basket, and, the proverbial what if he ever got hit by a truck kind of, thing comes up as it does in business. Right. And that was how it worked. So Steve brought forward an idea for a computer that was not, from what I was told, originally focused to be a, quote, business computer. It was supposed to be a high-end engineering machine that would rival engineering computers of the day, which had things like S100 bus, CPM. They were, the machines that really important people used. It was that kind of computer. So he designed a kind of a bus structure in which cards could be slotted into the bus, and then was able to get other team members to actually design the cards. And that's how the Model 2 kind of came about.
I wonder why they didn't go with the S100 bus.
I don't... Well, there was one other thing Radio Shack had, which was a very important thing to them, and they wanted to control what they, I guess we would call the ecosystem. They wanted to be able to control everything about the machine, from the hardware to the software, even to the furniture. They wanted the whole thing. And part of the reason was that if you can imagine a company that has thousands of retail stores in which you're paying by the square foot for retail space, and you're filling it with cables and parts and batteries and resistors and soldering irons and whatever else that they were selling at the time, it's easy to fill a store when you've got that type of merchandise on the shelves. But at the time that the Model 1 came out, and based on the success of the Model 1, Tandy had moved towards what they called the Tandy Computer Center. And this was designed to be a single retail space. There were, I think, I don't know what the ratio would be, but maybe one of those to every, say, 10 regular Radio Shack stores. But it was designed to be a professional computer store. And when you come into that store, it had to be all things Radio Shack. It had to be everything in Mercedes silver, and all the software in these, luxurious binders. And there had to be a differential between anything sold in that store that was Radio Shack and non-Radio Shack, because Radio Shack was all about margin. They could get massive margins on their products. And the one thing that they were always concerned about, which we see in the Model 1 as well, is that they didn't follow any supposed standards or commonly adopted interfaces, because they wanted to control the ecosystem. They didn't want to be like somebody else and kind of lose their, USP. They wanted that to be all about Radio Shack, and they wanted to be there and control that market. So S100 would just introduce third parties into their market, and then they'd have to compete against them.
Yeah, it's interesting. So they used off-the-shelf and some standardized components like the Shugart 8-inch floppy drive and the RCA monitor, the Motorola monitor, and the CRT, the analog subsystem there. But I guess they did that enough so they knew they could produce it and get it out the door, but as much as they could make proprietary, they did.
Yes, particularly in the software.
You mentioned the furniture, that they released the Model 2 desk when they released the Model 2. And that's one of the holy grails of Model 2 collectors is, that Model 2 desk. There are only a handful of them out there. I know a few people who have them, and they hold on to them as tight as anything.
Yeah, they're very rare. I got very lucky. I don't have one of those desks, but I have one of the printer stands for the printer for a Model 2.
Hey, that's good enough. That's close enough.
It's weird, but it doesn't take up as much real estate, which is nice. But at least it's a little piece of computing furniture history right there.
And when they released the Model 2, I guess it was in really very early 1980. It was somewhere in mid to early 1980. They released, like you said, the furniture. They released a whole slew of new printers. It was really a whole new family of a computer system that they released at one time. And it wasn't cheap, as you mentioned. The intro price on the 64K Model 2 was close to $4,000, which is, approximately close to $12,000 today. That's a significant cost.
Yeah. If you think back, I remember back in those days with, looking at business computers, and I did eventually become somebody who had to write software for business computers. So one of the things when you're trying to do that is getting your hands on the machine so you can actually do it. You were always looking at the retail pricing of these machines, and it wasn't uncommon that a business would go and finance $50,000, $100,000, $500,000, millions of dollars for computer hardware, particularly if they're in the mini computer range or the mainframe range. And, today you could probably do what an IBM mainframe did back then on a Raspberry Pi. I mean, it's a totally different world. But in those days, those computers were the business. I mean, everything was all about it. And what Radio Shack were trying to do was to carve out a piece of that market for themselves. And that was very, very difficult because it was a market that was dominated by the big iron players, the IBMs, the Digital, Wang, HP. These guys were established in that market. And here comes Radio Shack, known for selling you batteries and cable and resistors, and they want to come and sell you a $12,000 computer. I mean, it's hard to imagine, right?
Yeah, I can't believe that.
But they did it.
So some of the significant accessories that were released with the Model 2, one of them was the disk expansion unit, which allowed you to run 3 additional 8-inch floppy drives. That unit in and of itself with 3 drives was close to $2,500, which is about $7,000 today. So that was expensive. And if you've ever played with them or tried to lift one, these things are steel cases, and those 8-inch floppy drives are significant weight by themselves. And we have 3 of them in that steel cased unit with the power supply. It's a heavy load, let me tell you.
Yeah, the other thing which is interesting is you mentioned the desk. If you look at these machines, particularly look at the photographs of the old ones, what you'll find is that expansion unit with the 3 additional floppy drives was actually designed to fit in the desk. Yes. It wasn't designed to be sitting on top of a desk. You were expected to get the whole thing. And again, it goes to the whole Radio Shack wanting controlling the ecosystem. They wanted the computer, the desk, they wanted the expansion unit for the drives, and they wanted the printer, and they wanted the printer table, and you had to get the whole lot. I mean, and so what you're doing is you're going down to the bank and you're getting a line of credit or a lease or financing for $30,000, and you're writing it over to Radio Shack.
Yeah,
and that would have, that's a hard sell for your boss, I think.
I think they offered many different configurations, business systems they called, and I think that the most expensive one I could find in the catalogs was the Model 2 Deluxe 2 megabyte business system, which was almost $9,000, which is close to $30K today.
Wow.
Yeah, that came with a Model 2, the 3-drive expansion, a line printer 3, the Model 2 desk, and a printer stand.
Wow, that's amazing, isn't it? When you think about it, who would spend that sort of money today on a computer
that has Radio Shack on it?
Exactly.
And then you look at the $500 or whatever it was Model 1 sitting next to it. What a contrast.
Yeah, absolutely.
Let's talk a little bit about the specs of the unit. As in the Model 1 and 3, it was a Z80 based system, but it was a higher performance system. It was a 4 megahertz system, which was pretty peppy for 1980. It came in 32K, or 64K was much more likely, more common. It had 2 serial ports. It had a parallel port for printers, and it had an 80 by 24 character display. So a lot, standard specs for a business class computer at the time. It ran the Tristos for Model 2 operating system. Now, the first release was the 1.x. I think there was a 1.1 version, and it really was buggy and was pushed out probably a little too soon. It was quickly followed up with the Tristos for Model 2 2.0. Once it was released, there were a number of third-party CPMs that quickly became available for it. It didn't have the limitations of the Model 1 and Model 3, where there were system ROMs taking up lower memory. So there was a small bootloader ROM that was only in place when the system was booted. And once you booted the DOS off of the floppy disk, that bootloader was replaced, and you were working with truly pure 64K of RAM, which means that CPM would run pretty much out of the box on the system. So there were companies...
It's interesting you say about the CPM, because I was told that it was a very hard sell for Radio Shack to accept CPM on that machine. Although the machine spec-wise could handle it, they did not want to sell it at all because they knew that, again, it would dilute. You know, for example, if you were going into a Radio Shack store and you wanted to buy a word processor, they would sell you scriptset. That's just how it would work. You know, there might have been a couple of third-party alternatives that were pure TRS-80 style software, and of course the Model 2 was not compatible with the Model 1, so the Model 2 had its own suite of software, but you went in there, they would sell you scriptset. That's how it would work. If you said, yeah, but the other departments in my company run WordStar or whatever it might be, or they have Wang computers or something like that, the Radio Shack people would say, yeah, but we run scriptset. And that was the standard practice for the early year or so of the Model 2. It was a very hard sell in Texas for them to accept CPM on that machine. And when it was accepted, and you'll probably see this if you go back and look at some of the magazines, some of the history of the machines around that time, it was kind of not really all that well advertised. Yeah, we can do CPM. That would check off an objection on the sales process. But it wasn't something they were really all that serious about. And consequently, you don't hear too much about the CPM, although, it can run it. And from what my understanding is, it runs it pretty well.
Yeah, and at least from the Radio Shack perspective, that's true. But there were a lot of third-party CPMs that came in the market, like Pickles and Trout, FMG, Aton, Lifeboat. Just a whole slew of them came on board, and they really pushed Tandy to accept the CPM capabilities of the machine because Tandy really didn't have a choice because these third-party products were coming out. It really is. It's a pretty slick CPM machine when outfitted with some of these third-party CPMs. There was also a high-resolution graphics option, which was introduced. I'm not sure of the exact year, but it's probably around 1981, which allowed for 640 by 240 monochrome graphics. It's actually pretty slick. I have one in one of my machines, but there really was no known release software of any consequence that took advantage of it, which is a shame. There was a networking system that was introduced for the Model 2 late in the Model 2 line called ArcNet. It was a predecessor of Ethernet. And ArcNet was successful in some applications, but it was pretty much an abysmal failure on the Tandy machines. From what I've read, it was buggy, and it just never worked right. There were hardware issues. Some of the components were frying when they'd connect them to another computer. And as far as I know, they never really got it working correctly. I have not ever seen an ArcNet board for the Model 2. So, it was pretty much a failure, and they're pretty rare. I do have an ArcNet motherboard, but without any ArcNet cards for my Model 2s, there's really not much to do with it.
So what year was that? About, 81, 82, something?
I'm saying about 81, because it was introduced, from what I've seen, it was introduced just for the Model 2. And the Model 16, which we're going to talk about here in a second, was introduced in 1982. So I'm thinking it was somewhere around 1980, maybe late 1980.
Right. It's an interesting time because that's the time when IBM PC released their machine. Well, IBM released their PC.
Right.
And, that was... I remember then, it was funny because I happened to be a very early buyer of an IBM PC back in Australia where I was back then. And they were very expensive. And I remember that probably 6 months prior to the release of the IBM PC, there was a lot of kind of rumors and scuttlebutt on the street about IBM releasing this. No one knew if they were going to. And in 1981, the big player in the market was really Apple. The Apple II was very dominant back then. We did start to see the Osbornes and coming out around about 81, I think it was. Maybe even some of the early K-Pros started to come out. So, again, that's kind of a portable thing. But what it did was it brought CPM to the masses. And this must have caused Tandy or Radio Shack some heartburn because they had this enormously expensive machine in the Model 2, and in comes IBM, and in comes all these other machines at a much, much lower price point that were threatening that market that they'd built up. And my guess is that they had to find some way to differentiate themselves from these other entry-level machines, and the key then was going to be multi-user, or some sort of multi-sessional terminal thing, because one of the machines they was competing against was the Wang word processing system, and that was a little small work group word processing center, and they had to compete against that.
And they were on the ball, because in 1982 they introduced the Model 16, and the Model 16 uses the Motorola 68000 architecture, which is a 16-bit system. It could address a lot more memory than the Z80 based system could. So the hardware engineers, at least at Tandy, were on the ball. The problem is with the Model 16 when it was introduced was the operating system and the software that came with it. So it was released with TRS-80 16, which, to all intents and purposes was really a failure. What the story is behind that, we'll have to find out in a future episode if we can talk to some of the engineers if they're still around. But, apparently it was slow and it was not robust, and it still, did not have the more advanced concepts that you'd find in a modern operating system. Even at the time of directories, it was just a flat file system, so there were a lot of limitations to it. The Model 16 was also provided as an upgrade kit for existing Model 2s. What they would provide is they would provide a Motorola 68000 board and a matching 128K memory board and an upgraded power supply, and you could plug those into your Model 2, and now your Model 2 has become a Model 16. It also offered upgrades that it had two internal, what they called the thin line drives, so two 8-inch floppy drives could fit in the space of the Model 2's ShoeGuard drive. But like I said, the biggest issue was the lack of 16-bit software. It was really, and this, like you mentioned, this was such a time of upheaval and advancement in these computers that Tandy really dropped the ball, because it wasn't until almost a year later that they released an operating system for the Model 16 that was fairly robust, and that was an implementation of Xenix from Microsoft. And Xenix is sort of a lightweight Unix implementation. And that was released in about mid-1983, I believe. But that 1 year period was a killer for Tandy. If you go back and you read some of the magazine articles and books of the day, there was a lot of discussions. When the Model 16 was introduced, people were saying, "Why should I buy it? There's no software for it. There's no software that takes advantage of what the Model 16 has to offer. This advanced hardware, this 16-bit architecture was slick, but there was nothing to do with it." And that went on for about a year. And that critical time allowed their competitors to really, move forward and walk all over Tandy. And to me, that really was what broke the camel's back on the Model 2 line and sealed its fate, was that 1 year period there.
It makes a lot of sense. I mean, I know they had a relationship with Microsoft and Bill Gates from doing BASIC from back in the Model 1 days. And so it was easy enough to leverage upon that. But you're right, that was a time for so many things in computers, but also in things like arcades and video games. There was that whole dead period where things just weren't progressing. And I guess, what does it say, 82, 83, we had 4 or 5 years now of experience dealing with personal computers. The marketplace was getting a little more mature, and people had expectations, which they didn't have in 1978. You could give anything to somebody in 1978 and it was better than nothing. Well, now you didn't have that luxury. Your next product had to be significantly better than what it was for the Genesis product that you come out before.
The Model 16 is my favorite of all the Model 2 line of computers, because to me, what it does is it fixes a lot of the deficiencies in the Model 2, which is like the power supply was always mediocre in the Model 2. You got the dual disk drives, but it still came in that Model 2 package, which, at least compared to the subsequent computers in the Model 2 line, was smaller and compact. It was very easy to work on. There are only 2 screws you need to take off on the back of the machine, and the whole top cover lifts off, and you have access to all of the internals of the machine. So that, at least from a collector's perspective, and if anybody's interested in potentially obtaining one of these systems, very easy to work on from that perspective. So also in 1983, Tandy introduced the Model 12. And the Model 12 was a new iteration of the Model 2 line. It simplified the internals of the system. It combined a lot of the functionality that on the Model 2 and the Model 16 came on separate cards and incorporated them onto a single main board. And the only component that was a carryover from the Model 2 and Model 16 was the video keyboard card. So this was probably somewhat of a cost-saving move for Tandy. They went to a single board machine primarily, and it also made the system much more reliable. You and me, Myles, we've talked in the past about working on the Model 2 and the Model 16. If you get one that's working, just turning it on and having the screen come on is a success, and you feel good about yourself just that it runs. There's so many moving parts inside the Model 2. All of the cards, and they're constantly coming loose and constantly having to reseat the cards to get the machine to work properly. So it's definitely a labor of love, collecting a Model 2 or a Model 16. The Model 12 fixed a lot of those sorts of issues.
I don't have a Model 12 myself. It's a machine that I definitely would put on my bucket list, I think. I have a 16B, which is an interesting machine, but I totally agree with you. Servicing these machines is challenging, and particularly they're just big, bulky. They're almost like they're not big iron like an old mainframe machine or anything like that, but they have that kind of feeling when you crack the case and you open it up and you see the innards of the machine. You're like, oh no, what have I got myself into?
The Model 12 is interesting because it's a large case, but it's a lot of empty air inside of it because it was made to be expandable into a Model 16B, essentially, So there's a lot of empty space there. When you open one up, you're like disappointed. You're like, what? This thing is huge. It takes up a whole desk, but there's almost nothing inside. It's a main board and one video card. But like I said, it was meant to be expandable. The Model 16B was a Model 12, but they added a card cage to it, which was very similar to the card cage that was in the Model 2 and the Model 16. So it allowed you to add all of this additional functionality to the machine via the pluggable cards. So, for instance, you could add the high-resolution card that was released for the Model 2 and the Model 16. It works fine in the Model 16B. It's all compatible architecture. A hard disk card you could plug in. The 68,000 architecture card, along with its memory cards, would plug into that cage. So a Model 16B, when it's outfitted with the 68,000 subsystem, is a pretty impressive from a technology perspective machine. And so the Model 16B was introduced in late 1983. It's an upgraded Model 12, as we talked about. It did come with a little bit more memory than the Model 16 did. The Model 16 came with 128K. The Model 16B came with 256K. With the max of 768K. And what was really neat was a 16B HD iteration was released, which had a built-in 15 megabyte hard drive. So you didn't have to have the external hard drive sitting off to the side. It was all combined into one package. And then finally in 1985, Tandy introduced the Tandy 6000. So at this point, Tandy was really big into their PC line. And they were phasing out the TRS-80 platform. And they actually removed the TRS-80 name from the machine. So it's called the Tandy 6000. But it really it's just a slightly modified TRS-80 16B. It did have an improved performance on the 68,000 subsystem. They bumped it up to 8 megahertz. And you had a maximum of 1 megabyte of memory. And it also ran TRS Xenix 3, which was a great improvement over Xenix 1, which we talked about being released with the Model 16. And then finally, they had a Model 6000 HD, which was the 6000, the most powerful TRS-80 ever produced. And it had an internal hard drive as well. So the Model 6000 HD is really the top-of-the-line TRS-80 system you can buy. And I do have one here in my office, sitting next to my MacBook Pro, which is probably about 1,000 times more powerful, but it's about 1/10 the size.
Wow. I had read somewhere that the Model 16B was one of the most popular Xenix computers of the day. in terms of
Yes.
just volumes of
Yes.
sales for that.
It was at one point the most popular Unix-based workstation, volume-wise, in 1983 or in 1984.
Yeah, I remember there weren't too many options for small work group computer systems based on Xenix. I think we were running Olivetti machines, which I believe were just rebadged AT&T Unix machines, and they were fairly popular around about that time, but you didn't see too many machines that were in that. And I think, again, it was because IBM were out there sort of seeding the whole rumor market that they were about to come out with some sort of, local area networking technology everybody would love.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it was based on their mainframe technology. It was something totally different.
And as you touched on, the 16B and the 6000s had multi-user support when it ran Xenix. And, Tandy offered a RS-232 multi-port card. So I believe the maximum number of terminals you could connect to the machine was 5. You could have a RS-232 3-port card, and you could use the existing 2 serial ports on the machine. Tandy had a DT1 terminal that they released, which was a terminal that was optimized to work with the Xenix-based TRS-80s.
Yeah, I think they were very smart to actually do the 80 by 24 character set for the Model 2 from the very beginning.
Yes,
That was like a standard for terminal emulation to mainframes and mini computers back then. And they had set themselves up very well to be able to do that sort of thing. In fact, it's always been one of my... well, actually, I do this on a K-Pro here, but... it's always been a kind of a goal to have a Model 2 sitting there as a terminal on an internet connected, just a shell session to something, just because it's that standard screen size. And 80 by 24 is quite workable. I mean, you can actually work quite well in that environment. They had set it up very well for that.
Right. And as a new collector of TRS-80s, you're going to be quite surprised by how important Microsoft was to the TRS-80 platform. Whether it was the basic, the level 2 basic in the Model 1 machine, or Xenix in the Model 2 line. Xenix was a very popular system for the Model 2 line. It was pretty much the main operating system for the 6000 and 16B. It was the Microsoft product. As you're learning these systems, you're going to find the old manuals, published by Microsoft. So Bill Gates' hands were everywhere, not only in Windows and DOS, but he was involved with the TRS-80 machines as well.
Yep, so true. I was going to ask you a question. When you got your Model 2, what was your experience as an acquirer? Did your machine come in good shape? Did you have to do any tweaks to get it to work?
Well, I have a few Model 2s. The first one I purchased probably on eBay, I think. And I think that one is still in my basement and is not running properly. It would power up, but the screen wouldn't come on. And I fiddled around with it and played with it, and I could never get it to work, so I stuck it on a shelf. And then another Model 2 came up probably a few months later, and I think it was on Craigslist. And this one I was able to obtain personally and not have it shipped. So, it arrived, and it worked. And the key to collecting these machines, if any of our listeners are interested in collecting these machines, first of all, be ready for a lot of pain, because they're challenging machines to work with. But the key when you're starting is to get a working system. Because if you don't have a working system, and if you don't have a lot of experience with troubleshooting computers, these machines are a big challenge to figure out what is wrong, because there are so many moving parts that could affect, turning on the power and the screen not coming on. There's a plethora of things that could be wrong, from the video card to a memory card is not seated, to a problem with the BIOS, to the floppy drive. It's so many things that could be wrong. You're never going to figure it out. When you have a working system, you have the baseline there. And if it then stops working, it's a lot easier to troubleshoot and figure out what's going on. I don't know if that's been your experience, Myles.
Yeah, very similar. I guess like anybody, my first, like I had mentioned before, I'd always seen the Model 2 from afar, and it would always been that machine that you'd always want to get, because it is a very beautiful looking computer. Aesthetically, it's really a nice machine. It's a welcome addition to have in the collection. But getting hold of it is very hard. You see them come up on eBay, and people say, "Oh, I want to get it," and sometimes you can pick them up for $500 or maybe even cheaper. There's often deals, but what a lot of people forget is the sheer weight of this machine. It is. I think the last time one was shipped to me, the UPS guy told me it was about a 75-pound shipment for the machine. And now that might have been a lot of packing and a lot of other things, but these are not lightweight machines, and they don't ship well. And often the eBay sellers or whoever you're buying it from don't necessarily appreciate how important the machine is to you when you get it, and that you do, as you rightly say, want the thing in working order. And they don't care. They just slap it in a box, stick some foam around it, tape it up, take it down to Pack and Ship or whoever, and then off it goes, and they think that's good enough. They don't realise these machines break. And my experience has been that the Model 2s are probably a little more durable for shipping than the Model 16, at least my 16B experiences have been. The 16B, I'm not sure about the 16, but the 16B has that white plastic case, very similar to the Model 4, and the white plastic does not age as well from the point of view of resilience, and it shatters very easily. Now, I've seen the same with the Mercedes silver cases on the Model 2, but I've never so far had a Model 16 arrive that did not sustain some form of damage in shipment. And
I can't reiterate enough to the listeners out there. If you're interested in purchasing one of these machines, and you go the eBay route, and the eBay route is almost the only route you can do because these machines are so uncommon. Try as hard as you can to pick up the machine in person.
Yeah,
agree. I've had a number of these machines shipped to me, and like you said, the Model 2 and the Model 16A definitely weather the trip better because of their smaller cases, and I think the plastic was a little more durable, and the case design as well. It's a multi-segmented case, so it can flex a little bit more. The later Model 12, 16B, and 6000 cases, it's one large plastic piece, and it's even larger than the Model 2, and that plastic, like you said, is getting older and it's getting more brittle, and I can almost guarantee you that there's going to be damage if you try to ship one of those via UPS, unless you have a very, very dedicated seller who really knows what they're doing. One route that I've taken with those bigger machines to ensure their safety in shipping, if you really have to ship them, is you take them apart. So you open them up, you take out the floppy drives, you unhook the CRT from the plastic frame, because remember, these frames are plastic, and this heavy CRT is attached via screws to the plastic bezel. The floppy drives are mounted, primarily to the bottom case, which is a thicker plastic, but they're also attached to the plastic frame on the top. And when these things are dropped, from in UPS transition somewhere, all of that stress of that weight is applied to those plastic frames, and they invariably will crack and shatter on you. I would almost guarantee it. So definitely try to pick them up in person if possible.
Yeah, that's it. Totally been my experience. I mean, like you, my Model 2 that I've got that works beautifully, I picked it up in person off a guy on Craigslist, and it was the best thing I could have done. Not only did it help him out, but it certainly helped me out. And even if it meant I was thinking of driving across state lines to try to pick up Model 16s and so on if I found them, because it's just not something you feel comfortable with. They are rare. They do tend to sell quite high in terms of computer pricing because of their scarcity. And the last thing that you want to do is to spend a lot of money on one of these machines and then find it comes to you in pieces. As you rightly say, You want to be able to have your first experience with the machine, to plug it in, turn it on, get that insert disk message on the screen, pop in the disk, and off you go. That's what you want. Mm-hmm. That's hard to do in the Tandy world. It mm-hmm. is a little easier to do in things like, say, the Apple IIs and the Ataris and so on. But in the TRS-80 world, that is a little more difficult to achieve. But I just would say to anybody out there that's looking to get one of these machines, if you get an opportunity to, run to that opportunity and get one of these machines. You will not be, you won't be sorry that you did it. But make sure that in getting it, you try not to use a shipper to be between you and the seller if you can avoid it. And I think you'd be really happy with the end result.
Yeah, and again, try to get a working one. If you see pictures of it and it's not displaying the Tristos loading screen or the Xenix boot screen, there's probably a problem somewhere in that system. But I don't want to dissuade, a determined person from obtaining one of these, because if you really work at it and you're really determined to get one working, there's nothing more satisfying than powering one of these babies up and hearing, the floppy drive spin. In the Model 2, it's a continuously running floppy drive, so it's always running. You got the fan going. It makes a lot of clunky noises. It's very satisfying. And if you have one of the Xenix systems with the 68000 subsystem, the complexity of the system when it's all running and you're sitting there and you think about what's going on inside of that box, so many different mechanical pieces and electronic pieces all communicating that are, 30, 35 years old, and you're actually able to sit there and use this machine. To me, it's one of the most satisfying things that I can do.
Yep, so true. You'd mentioned before about the floppy drives running continuously. Mm-hmm. I recently started to notice some threads on various mailing lists, computer forums, and so on, about people coming up with solid-state storage options for the Model 2s, the 16s, and so on. Have you had experience in these things as yet?
Yes, actually, I used the HXC floppy drive emulator. It's an SD card floppy drive emulator from Lotharic in Poland. It's a pretty popular solution for lots of computers, and I use them quite extensively. I have one right here on my Model 6000. I use them on the Model 2, and it's a plug-in, replacement for the ShoeGuard drives. You need an adapter board because the ShoeGuard drives are a 50-pin connector, but there are adapter boards readily available that you can convert them to the 34-pin more standard of the 5 1/4 floppy emulators like the HXC. And it works well, and I use them almost exclusively because, 8-inch floppy media, reliable floppy media is very hard to find, and these drives are very finicky. Especially the thin-line drives are much more finicky than the drives found on the Model 2 ShoeGuard drives, the big ones. They're fairly reliable, but the thin-line drives are very, very flaky. I have a number of them that just don't work, and sometimes I call them the devil because they'll work, you'll become content with it, and you'll start trusting it, and then you'll put one of your rare software disks in there, and then it'll just eat up your track 0 and ruin your disk, and you just start yelling at the machine. That's happened to me a few times.
How have you been able to get your floppy disk images onto that storage?
Well, I actually have a large collection that I made available on the Model 2. It's called the Model 2 Archive. And I'll put it in the show notes, but we have a large collection of Model 2 images in IMD format, which you can easily load onto the SD card that runs on the HXC. And we have pretty much all of the operating systems. A lot of the Tandy software is available. Almost everything that was available back in the day are available via these images. So, you get an SD card and you load it up with these images, and you can have an enjoyable Friday night with your Model 2 going through all of the software that was available from back in the day.
That's fantastic. And have you had any experience with hard drive emulators?
I've used some actual physical hard drives from back in the day. Like in my Tandy 6000 I have here has the internal 15 megabyte hard drive. I do have a Model 2 that has a system called the Hans 01 adapter, which is an adapter that lets you plug in a hard drive emulator, but it only runs LS-DOS Interesting thing about that version of LS-DOS, it's the same version of LS-DOS that runs on the Model 4. So they're highly compatible. So software that runs on the Model 4 will run, almost all of it will run on a Model 2.
That's amazing. I did not know that.
Mm-hmm.
Very cool.
So there's so much to learn. Probably one of the most popular places where people discuss the Model 2 would be the VCF forums. Mm-hmm. At the VCF, where is it now? ed.org. So that Tandy forum is probably the best place for you to get information, help, and assistance on getting one of these machines running.
Well, I'm sure there's plenty of opportunity in future episodes of your show to deep dive into these things and go into that. I know those are issues that are fresh on my mind. It's like, how do I preserve these machines for the future by not relying too much on spinning media?
Yep, there's a lot of conversation going on in that regard. All right, so I think that wraps up our history lesson for today on the Model 2 platform. Everything, we'll have links in the show notes that of anything that we mentioned that would require that. I want to thank Myles for joining us for this segment. And Myles, I look forward to talking with you more about the Model 2 in future episodes.
Oh, I'd love to. It's a passionate subject of mine. I'd absolutely love to be talking about that.
Great, thanks. Thanks for joining us on this high-level overview of the Model 2. Please send us your feedback and let us know what you want to see more of in regards to this historically important microcomputer. I just wanted to thank all the listeners again for your warm feedback and support. Your comments really do make a difference, so keep sending your input. It will only help to make the show better. Until next time, keep trash talking.